Salutations, dear viewers. This is George from Ireland, and this video is about Cesare Beccaria and his contribution to criminology. He's widely regarded as having been the father of criminology. So, this is the correct pronunciation of his name. It's the Italian pronunciation of Caesar, and Beccaria tried to accentuate it correctly. It doesn't really matter. I often hear people saying Cesare or Beccaria, things like that. So he was from Italy, obviously, and he was around in the 18th century. He graduated from the University of Padua in 1758. By a curious coincidence, that's precisely a century before his spiritual heir, Dr. Lombroso. Whilst he was studying law, Beccaria was set an essay on penology, as in the study of punishment, and this piqued his curiosity, and he turned his very fertile mind to the wider question of criminal law. Begged the question, what is a crime? It's odd to reflect that the definition of a crime has varied enormously through time and geography. Certain things are permitted now that would have been forbidden not long ago. For example, homosexual acts in most Western countries, completely legal, were illegal in most places 50 years ago. Certain things are forbidden now, which would have been permitted not long ago, say cruelty to animals or something. Certain things are allowed in certain parts of the world, for instance, polygamy, whereas in particular countries that's illegal. And I could go on, and some people say, well, a crime, the very straightforward definition, it is something that is prohibited by criminal law. So Beccaria was growing up in Italy when virtually everybody was Catholic, 99% of the population, and the law was quite closely related to sin, and blasphemy was a crime. That's insulting Christianity. So the church thought people should feel guilty and would be punished in the afterlife for their sins. Bear in mind the Pope was a political, not just a spiritual leader, ruled the papal states, most of central Italy. So physical punishments were very common, whipping people, branding them, occasionally cutting off parts of their body, mutilations or amputations, and also at a familial level this went on as well. Children being beaten by their parents was quite common, severely beaten, could even be broken bones. Teachers hitting their pupils was entirely permissible back then. And one of the odd things is violence was often entirely legal, really depended who was doing it to whom. And even if it was a crime of violence, so long as it wasn't murder, the penalty was actually quite light in most cases, whereas crimes against property were severely punished. And Beccaria reflected that it's those with political power make the law, and those with political power tend to be the affluent. Possessions 9/10 of the law was a very apposite maxim at the time. So he also looked into prisons, Beccaria, and thought that they were hugely overcrowded, and those who were living in penury often turned to crime simply to sustain themselves. So were they criminal because they were wicked, or it was because they were impecunious? It seemed that their indigence compelled them to steal simply to keep body and soul together. People lived in the most filthy conditions, and in these ghastly conditions in prison they were unlikely to be improved, and so they had to hear mass, and that was thought to be morally improving. So those who were very wealthy committed crime usually got away with it. It struck Beccaria as immoral and irrational. His conscience was pricked by the barbarous punishments that were meted out to malfeasance, and he noticed there was a gross disequilibrium between the severity of the wrongdoing and the severity of the punishment inflicted upon the malefactor. The magistrates would hand down savage sentences against some people who'd broken the law in a trivial way, whereas those who'd committed horrendous crimes might escape with a mild punishment. So Beccaria thought this was not reasonable, and it was leading on to the Enlightenment, where being reasonable was the thing that an enlightened man would aspire to be. So Beccaria said we must look at everything rationally and set aside this idea of sin not moralized quite so much. So the criminal law shouldn't be run on biblical lines. Beccaria felt there ought to be a sliding scale of punishments, and it was logical that trifling offences be punished with something mild, and misdemeanours such as trespass or the slightest act of theft be punished with maybe just a warning, a small fine, community service, and at the opposite scale, murder would be most severely punished. Surely that stands to reason that heinous crimes should attract severe punishments. So Beccaria felt that judges obviously needed to preside over criminal trials. Incidentally, they didn't have juries in Italy at the time. That's something rather from the Anglosphere. Fair trials were crucial, and he noticed that the trials were quite often not fair, and the bench was often prejudiced against the defendants, and the defendants were often illiterate or couldn't speak Italian properly or Latin. In fact, trials were often conducted in Latin. The lawyer and the judge are speaking to each other. The defendants or the witnesses were often speaking Italian or the local dialect. Bear in mind, it's only the late 19th century. Most Italians could actually speak standard Italian. So he noticed that the judiciary seemed to assume that the poor were guilty anyway. And sometimes poor people were paid to take the rap for wealthy people who had actually committed crimes. So the prosecution case wasn't properly scrutinized by the defense, which was also unfair. Fascinatingly, Beccaria felt that judges ought to be permitted no leeway in the punishments they handed down. They simply had to determine guilt or innocence, and then there would be a table of sentences that they must pass, and they mustn't take into account the individual circumstances. Whether one is rich or poor, committing theft, that was it, you must get the same sentence. Whether it's a first-time offence or you committed this offence 20 times, you must get the same sentence. That was fair. So they wouldn't have regard to the circumstances of the case. So punishments must be predictable, he felt, and because otherwise one was a hostage to fortune. Some judges might be very lenient, others might be very punitive, and that would be unfair. So that personality of the judge must have nothing to do with it. So it was really about deterrence for Beccaria, as well as justice to some extent, that a person will know that if I commit such and such a crime, this is the penalty that I will suffer. By making the penal code more predictable, one will make it more efficacious in discouraging people from breaching the criminal law. Now, but isn't that illogical and unjust? Supposing there's a penniless woman who steals to save her starving baby's life, she should be punished severely as a very wealthy person who steals money out of sheer avarice. Anyway, so Beccaria felt he was acting in consonance with rational principles, and people are less likely to commit ghastly crimes if they know that they will face a heavy penalty. So he realized that crime couldn't be prevented all the time, and that larceny was committed chiefly because people were living in dire poverty. He was one of the first people to come out against the death penalty. He felt capital punishment was illogical and unfair. So the state is saying that killing people is wrong, and will prove this by killing people. It strikes at the heart of illogic to claim this. It's a very hypocritical thing to do, and the state must be better than that. So he penned a volume entitled De Delitti e de Peni, of Crimes and Punishments. Not quite the same as Dostoevsky's novel. Catherine the Great, the Tsarina of Russia, she is said to have read this avidly, although it didn't seem to affect Russian criminal law at the time. So he thought that law should be more humane, more consistent, more predictable. So as I pointed out, one can castigate Beccaria. There are certainly failings, but he made a start, which nobody had. So he blazed a trail, and people followed in his footsteps. He founded criminology, and for that reason that we owe him a lot. And he thought that law had to be fairer and more consistent. And to that extent, Beccaria's work is surely laudable.